And we're live. Welcome to today's live stream. Communism, Fascism, Radical Islam, and America. Illiberalism there and then and here and now. This is sponsored by Free Black Thought, the Institute for Liberal Values, Rutgers Psychology Department, the Society for Open Inquiry in Behavioral Sciences, and Rutgers Fair Chapter. We've got an all-star panel for you today, including Sarah Hayter, who's an activist, writer, and the co-founder of Ex-Muslims of North America and the Rights and Religious Forum, here to talk to us about radical Islam. We have Isabella Tabarovsky. The panelist is a senior program associate with the Kennan Institute, the Wilson Center, and a contributing writer to Tablet to talk to us about Soviet communism. We've got Martin Gack, who has a PhD in philosophy, is interested in rules and the ways in which action is guided. He's a producer in German television, and he also works as a religious affairs correspondent, and he is very familiar with fascism in Argentina. And we've got Christian Watson, who works with Color Us United and is the host of the Pensive Politics podcast. And he works with Kenny Xu and will be speaking to us about Chinese communism. As our discussants, we've got Eric Smith, who is a professor of rhetoric at York College, and he's the co-founder of Free Black Thought. He's also a senior fellow for the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, FAIR, and a writing fellow for the Heterodox Academy. Lee Jessam, who really pulled all this together for us, is a distinguished professor and chair in the psychology department at Rutgers University. And David Bernstein, another discussant, is the founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values and co-founder of the Institute for Liberal Values. My name is Jennifer Richmond. I'm the moderator. I'm the host of the Hold My Drink podcast, co-founder of the Institute of Liberal Values, and community coordinator for the Moral Courage Project. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand the mic over to Lee, who is going to start us off.
Well, just first, warm welcome to everybody, the panelists, discussants, and everyone who's viewing this to our panel on American illiberalism. I'm just going to start off with, what do we mean by illiberalism? Well, I don't know what any of you mean, but so I'm going to start with what I mean by the term. There's different ways to think about what illiberalism is. One is to think about it as the opposite of liberalism. So that raises the question, what is liberalism? And again, this is how I think of liberalism. It's a commitment to individual human rights, freedom of religion, speech, association, a vigorous free press committed to truth-telling, due process protections against potentially malevolent or overzealous government and other authorities. It includes robust knowledge generation, idea exploration systems that embrace endless public debate, discussion on just about any issue. Illiberalism is then the opposite. It's rejection of individual human rights, say in favor of replacing them with collective rights and collective rewards and collective punishments. It includes a callous disregard or outright suppression of freedom of religion, speech, association, and a free press. And it includes typically propaganda replacing truth-seeking. But another way to think about illiberalism is by examining the history of manifestly illiberal systems that are just so obviously and so rife with oppression and abuse that they can give as examples sort of insight into what constitutes illiberalism. So, for example, the death toll associated with the transatlantic slave trade was in the millions. The death toll from colonialism was in the tens of millions, and both created unimaginable suffering among the living. In the name of national greatness, the Nazis and Japanese perpetrated mass murder on unimaginable scales and unleashed the most hellish war the world has yet seen. In the name of social justice and equality, the French Revolution, the Soviets, and the Chinese Communists committed mass murder also on unimaginable scales and also created unimaginable human suffering among those who were left living. So this kind of naturally raises the question, what does any of this have to do with American illiberalism in the 21st century? Well, the story of this panel was that the initial inspiration for it was my discovery of Isabella's essay titled The American Soviet Mentality, which went into this comparison with the Soviet in some detail. And so we put together this panel to address exactly this question. What does any of this have to do with American illiberalism in the 21st century? So without any further ado, I turn it back to you, Jen, to launch the panel discussion.
Okay, great. Well, I think let's start with Soviet communism and illiberalism. And I'd love to have Isabella speak on that. She is not only been reviewing this stuff, but she also is a Soviet American immigrant. So she has a lot of background.
Thank you so much, Jen, and thank you so much, Lee. It's really great that this has come together. I'll in fact start with the article that Lee has referred to, because this is really, I wrote it in June of last year in response to that infamous Tom Cotton op-ed where he proposed in the pages of the New York Times to bring that the troops be brought into American cities to curb the violence and looting that was happening at the time as part of the protests against the killing of George Floyd. And a large group of journalists of the New York Times found the op-ed offensive, asserted that it put them in danger. And they also publicly attacked as a group Barry Weiss, who was then an opinion editor of the New York Times, for expressing an opinion that disagreed essentially with their position. She characterized what was happening at the Times as a civil war between the mostly young wokes who call themselves liberals and progressives and the mostly 40-plus liberals who adhere to the principles of civil libertarianism. So that's the quote. And she was absolutely excoriated for it. I mean, people were just really vicious toward her. And I wrote that piece, The American Soviet Mentality, in response to that. And I think it was also a reflection on what I think all of us had been watching in that summer, in that spring and summer, a series of so-called cancellations of prominent individuals and less prominent individuals, their jobs, careers, reputations being destroyed, and kind of the mob rule, right? I think it's all fairly well known at this point. And I compared it to what I knew from the Soviet Union. I grew up in the USSR. I came to America when I was 19, so already more than 30 years ago. And this was really the first time when I had these kind of parallels rising up for me. And I think that piece created quite a stir, because I think it was the first time that people really began to think kind of comparatively about what was happening in America. It was a complicated moment. So in the piece, I compared what was happening in America with the cancellation of cultural and academic figures to the vilification and demonization of writers in the USSR, such as the writer Nobel Prize winner Boris Pasternak. It's a very well-known case in Russia. So what's interesting is that in his case, in that case, it was the government that gave the signal. But in the end, the government didn't actually need to lift a finger to destroy him. The entire society had been already so conditioned to read the signals that it knew exactly what it needed to do. So other writers banded together to vilify him publicly. Students of literary institutes got together and demonstrated against him, against his wrong opinions, right, and his wrong thought. At political meetings across the country, lecturers and activists castigated him. People were signing petitions, even though they never read his novels because they were not published in the USSR. But they, there was a phrase, I didn't read, but I disapprove, right? So there seemed to be these incredible parallels to what was happening in America. And one of the things that I understood very, very clearly in that moment is that suddenly America was filled with fear. And I had never experienced that kind of fear in America before, but I recognized it. I recognized it the moment I started calculating, well, should I be saying it on Twitter or should I be writing it on Twitter? Are they going to drag me through the mud? And that fear of what might happen to you, it almost has this physiological quality. It's like this cold, sweaty kind of fear. I suppose that it could be different for everyone. And I remember some of those instances, and I remember making a conscious decision that I'm just not going to be afraid anymore because I can't. I have been afraid like this before, and I refused to do it. And I wondered if somebody who was born and grew up in America actually recognizes this fear. Because for me, I couldn't accept it, but I can see how people would accept it because it may sort of be, it seems to have some rational components to it. And so in that Soviet kind of example, we really have a phenomenon, an example of how and what was happening in America at that time and continues to happen today. I think perhaps it has lost a bit of an edge emotional edge, because I think we've all gotten used to it, but it certainly still happens. People get fired from their jobs all the time for thinking differently or expressing a wrong opinion. But I think that what we see in America in that phenomenon is how a society actually, when it's properly conditioned, begins to act out sort of conformist and totalitarian scripts simply on the strength of this implicit fear that has been planted inside of it. And it doesn't take too many cases. It takes just a few kind of showcase cases to impose that fear on society. And then all of a sudden, America stops kind of practicing what I always associated with America, which is what Lee was talking about, freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, the presumption of innocence, right, becomes somehow less important when somebody is being dragged in this public kind of through social media, in this public showcase trials, right? So social shame is a very powerful mechanism to keep people in check. And so I think that it's this fear and overcoming it is what really, it's a question that weighs most heavily on my mind, because I think that we now, compared to last year, I think that there are already examples of resistance. There are already examples of actions. People are coming together in groups in order to fight these trends. But I think what we need to do as a society is to examine how this fear can influence us, because it was very easy last year, and I think it can happen again. And next time it can be worse. And so that's just something that I think we all need to worry about and think about. So I'll stop here, and we can talk about it more in the discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Isabella. So staying on the communisms, let's bring Christian Watson in to talk about Chinese communism and illiberalism. Thank you, Christian. Mike is yours.
All right. Thank you guys so much. And again, thank you guys for letting me be here. I'm really excited. I'm a student of history. And so the Chinese Communist Revolution is a particular interest of mine. And so I want to start this conversation off. I'm kind of following Lee. I want to talk about foundations first. All political movements have some kind of foundation. Even if those foundations are not expressly stated, all political movements have some kind of foundation. In fact, I think one of the best things about the United States of America was that our foundation was so expressly stated, and not was it so expressly stated, it was expressly stated on the basis of fundamental universal truths that are not subject to the whims of an authoritarian, a despot, or any kind of law. And that's why the American experiment is so powerful. And that's why I'm happy we're having this conversation about illiberalism. Because liberalism, at least in the classical sense, as it was understood by the founders, and as it was bequeathed from the tradition of the natural law people, the natural rights people, of which I am, I think, an inheritant of, which all of us as human beings are inherited of, liberalism simply means, in my opinion, and of course there are broad definitions, but it means an affirmation of the fundamental value of the individual and everything that follows from that. Now, of course, it gets more complicated as you get deeper into it. But the foundation of the Chinese Communist Revolution, which I think we can discern, not just from the actions of those who partook, the millions who partook in Mao's sort of psychosis, but we can discern them from the words of Mao himself. So these are quotations from the Little Red Book. I'm going to read two because I don't have a lot of time. And these will, I think, establish succinctly what the intellectual foundations of Chairman Mao were. He says, classes struggle. Some classes triumph. Others are eliminated. Such is history. Such is the history of civilization for thousands of years. To interpret history from this viewpoint is historical materialism. Standing in opposition to this viewpoint is historical idealism. Second one, in class society, everyone lives as a member of a particular class. And every kind of thinking, he's taken the physical being of a class to your mental thinking, without exception, is stamped with the brand of a class. So Mao and his adherents believed that, just as Marx believed, that class was this all-encompassing thing that overrides everything about you except your class status, which is interesting because without your individuality, without you existing as an individual human being, indivisible, class status couldn't even come into the picture. But they didn't really care about this fact. And so you see the parallels in modern day American conversation with organizations, groups, and thinkers who reduce the individual to simply a unit of some kind of broader struggle, whether it's with critical race theorists who see society basically as a conglomerate of struggles between power and privilege, whether it is Antifa or other kind of far left activists who go out and they assemble under the idea of the black bloc tactic, and which assumes a certain uniform set of principles, which also reduce human beings to like a single quality. For example, police officers, all of them have to be authoritarians because they're police officers, things like that. We see the kind of Maoist thinking reflected in many other cultural organizations and movements in America as a whole. And this is so dangerous, not just because of cancel culture, although cancel culture is a pretty good expression of this sort of aversion towards seeing the human being as a whole. Because what cancel culture does is simply reduces the human being to their actions, and by doing that, it makes the actions say something more about our ability to be better than our actions, our ability to habituate away from our actions. So in a sense, I think that this goes right into the sort of some sort of Maoist tendencies, because they had struggle sessions back then, and they were seen as a product of people were seen as a product of their circumstance or their environment, as Mao said. But it goes beyond cancel culture, and it goes deeper to the fact that we have people who are trying to craft policy on the basis of these ideas within a structure that is absolutely anathema to these ideas. So when we say American illiberalism, when we say cancel culture, when we say Mao's cultural revolution, I think we ought to think about how these things interact with who we are fundamentally as human beings, and not just who we are as as political people or as people who are interested in political subjects. Because the idea that I have rights, that I am a rational being, that I'm capable of higher thinking, that I am more than any single distinction, transcends any, it's not simply a mere political idea. It is a reality that I can see and anyone else can see in their everyday lives if they choose to open their eyes to it. But we're seeing a lot of similar tactics, single-minded thinking that was resembled in the communist revolution in China and in other revolutions around the world, reduce our ability to see that fact. And that's probably the most dangerous things that could happen to a free people. As Machiavelli said, I'll end on this. I don't quote Machiavelli very much because I'm not a very big fan. But as Machiavelli said, he said, if you can make, and I'm paraphrasing heavily, if you can make a free people forget their ancient liberty, you can, you can't conquer a people because they will not forget their ancient liberty. So if someone understands that they're free and that they are an individual, you cannot conquer them. And so the goal is to get people to see themselves not as an individual, but as part of a collective. And again, that's something we should all open our eyes to. So thank you guys so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Christian. And we'll move from the left illiberalism of communism now to Martin Gack to speak about fascism and Argentinian fascism and his experiences there as well.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you to the rest of you. So I'm not entirely sure where to begin, but essentially I think it's worthwhile saying, and I mean, maybe this is a bit of a contrast with what Christian and with Isabella had pointed out. I generally think it's quite important to draw clear distinctions between historical experience and although it is of course possible to interpret anything that we find in our sort of immediate political environment in terms of experiences or political or historical experiences that are on record, I think that it's always worthwhile to keep in mind that, number one, the distinctions usually are profound and define important contextual differences. And, Mao or the Soviet experience or the Argentinian experience, I do not believe that when we actually look into the American landscape, we can certainly produce this kind of translations. Generally, I mean, I will go back to this probably at some point, I hope, in this discussion, because I think it's actually very important. One of the reasons why I'm saying this is because those of us who are actually engaged in this kind of debate should resist by all means possible the use of these categories like fascism, communism, Marxism, collectivism, statism, which really have no more function than essentially saying yuck. Essentially, it's a term of abuse. And a term of abuse doesn't really have any purchase in terms of the political discussion. It's great when we are inside our little bubble in which we all agree that these are issues. Now, in terms of Argentina, it's particularly interesting to me. I work a lot on fascism. And I really use fascism only for one single episode in history, and that is interwar Italy. There is nothing else that is fascism. I think that most of the stuff that is coming out of American scholarship on fascism is actually crap. It's stuff that is so completely rooted in this idea that fascism is essentially just an insult, that it gets deployed to talk about things that have absolutely no relation. So reading Ur-Fascism from Umberto Eco is usually a good idea, because I think that he sets an interesting position, which is that there are elements and features that one might recognize in various different movements. But fascism with the big F, in which you have Gentile and Mussolini basically building an ideological system of sorts, which, according to Eco, there is no full ideological system, and that might be the success of fascism. It's actually something that only happens in the interwar period between Rome and Milano, really, and the South can be more or less excluded. In Argentina, we did not have fascism to one particular extent, which is that we did not have the collectivization of the body politics. We actually had something that was much closer to tyranny. But in that tyranny that was actually supported by the best that Chicago schools of economics had to offer, which was the Chicago boys running wild in Latin America, essentially doing economic evangelization from neoliberalism and making sure that anybody that had anything that smelled red on them would be crushed or thrown out of airplanes. And I'm not exaggerating this. In that process, two things, in contrast to what was said by Isabel and by Christian, is that the point, the substantial content of the ideological position is absolutely irrelevant. The point is there is a modus operandi and there is a formal disposition towards essentially expressions of dissent all the way from the public to the most intimate, not only what you say in public, but essentially who you're screwing on your bed and what are you thinking when you're actually sitting down in your bedroom or in your bathroom. All of these things are essentially totalitarian drift is essentially the thorough penetration of the eye of the state into the space of the public, the private, and the intimate. And now the thing that to me is important to remember, the fear of which Isabella spoke, which I remember on my skin. I mean, I was born in 74, and between 76 and 83, basically the brunt of the military system of violence was put in place. By the time I age politically, my first memories are the stories of friends of family being whisked away in the middle of the night with children and spouses and grandparents. I mean, I have a really long and big, anecdotarium of really ugly stories, which incidentally, I should say, like David, that the reason why I actually started to think of this is, again, because of Isabella. It was a conversation with Isabella that actually brought this question to the fore. And I will say this one thing, which I think it's really quite central. One of the most interesting things about the penetration of the state into what Mussolini and Gentile called the eye of the people, the life of the people, actually the term gets actually built up around 27 and is used, 22, and is used against Mussolini by a journalist called Amendola. Amendola eventually gets killed, and then Mussolini and Gentile picked up the term and used it actually with great pride to explain that, yes, indeed, what they're trying to do is push from the bottom up. They're trying to build something that does not start at the government house and basically dictates down. This is really very important. There was a discussion 2 or 3 days ago between Karen Attia and Kasparov in a debate on Intelligence Square, in which Attia essentially said that there is no such thing as cancel culture. Of course, I mean, we understand perfectly this is complete bullshit. I mean, the whole point about culture is that you do not need an institutional framework. I mean, the entire point is that you have something that is nebulous and that has to be actually accounted for by looking through essentially a cultural field. The one thing that we do recognize when we look into academia, into show business, into literature, we look into like any sort of area of American life that now, by the way, is actually seeping into European life as well. I mean, I don't call Britain Europe anymore, thank God. But I mean, in Europe, we're actually seeing this. The fact is that what we're seeing come in is specifically the sense of fear. It's the sort of the chilling effect of knowing that there are not only certain words that you cannot say, there are thoughts that you cannot have. There are things you better not write, and there are things you better don't be seen reading. And I mean, this particular thing is, to me, interesting in relation to what I remember from my Argentine experience, because it doesn't really require any particular ideological pointer. It could be that I'm no longer allowed to read, Kipling. Kipling is, by the way, is a no-no in public spaces. It could be that I'm not allowed to read Kipling, but at the same time, I mean, a question that to me has become actually quite interesting in relation to transgenderism is this sort of putative ontology that runs through the transgender discourse. It's, on the one hand, we have transgender fluidity or gender fluidity, but then on the other hand, we have an account of what I really am, right? I mean, as if there were an homuncular account deep inside of me. I'm really this thing, and this is the thing that finally finds true expression. So these things are absolutely absolutely reconcilable. Asking the question that I just asked is no longer viable, it's no longer permitted. And people are actually afraid. And what comes with that is essentially, and this is what I find frightening, is that there is a thorough and immediate endorsement of scientific and discursive illiteracy. Because when we can no longer ask the questions, I mean, we're not allowed to fuck up, then we can no longer really produce emendations. We can no longer actually improve the process of thinking. We cannot improve our methods. So, okay, so to close, I mean, maybe I have to. I may completely run over my time. Okay, I'll stop there.
Okay, well, we've got one more panelist, and then we'll get into some of these deeper questions that Martin brought up. Thank you for that, Martin. We've got Sarah Haider going to speak to us about illiberalism and radical Islam. Sarah, the floor is yours.
All right, let me unmute there for a little bit. Hi, everyone. Right, so I have not timed my notes, so I might go over as well. Please let me know, Jen, if I do. But I'll go over a little bit of my history and experience with Islam and the activism that really has everything to do with my understanding today of the prevalence of American illiberalism. I'm an atheist ex-Muslim. I am the co-founder and executive director of Ex-Muslims in North America. We are an organization that exists to fight for the rights and dignities of apostates from Islam. Of course, I can't speak to the faith of every individual Muslim, but I think most everyone listening to this and the panelists will be aware that Islam is broadly not a religion that has been very friendly to its dissidents or is very tolerant to different viewpoints historically and even today. And the most clear way I think I can illustrate this is not by necessarily the incidents of terror, which I think we discuss quite a bit in our public discourse, but I think we can see this best by what the scriptures, the Quran and the Hadith, have to say about the treatment that awaits those who leave the faith or offended in some form. Even more clearly, it can be illustrated by how many believers today treat apostates. There's an enormous stigma that's associated with apostasy. Apostates are sometimes in fear of losing their lives, and this is not an unjustified paranoia. There's about a dozen countries in the world today where apostasy is still a crime that's punishable by death. So that's my background context. I became aware of American illiberalism. I guess wokeism is what I call it outside of this discussion here. But I became aware of it through my activism, through the work of highlighting the problems within the faith so that we can better address them. And I found very quickly that my criticisms were not welcome, even by my fellow liberals, especially by my fellow liberals, I would say. So this was a shock to me, and I didn't understand what was going on and why, and what appeared to me to be a very clear-cut issue, right? The rights of apostates, the right to live, rights of women to be equal participants in our world. This is something that seemed to me that no Westerner should have any hesitancy in supporting. But I found that this was not the case, and indeed, it was really impossible to speak about this. And it was one of those paradoxical things. It should have been something that was easier to speak about than anything else, and yet it was extremely difficult. And even in advocating for my own, right to exist, essentially, I was accused of advocating for bigotry against the people. So there's this topsy-turvy discourse, and I just couldn't make sense of it when I first encountered it. But then it became clear to me, as I think it has become clear to many others, that there's a certain unspoken, unacknowledged ideology, a software running in the background, you can say, in progressive circles, and that ideology looks and feels and behaves very much like a religion, and you can even say, a fundamentalist religion. And the worst part, I think, the worst part about going last in a panel like this is that so many people have already made all these great points. So I'm going to go to what I think I might bring here that's unique, which is I think what is anti-dogmatic about liberalism is its insistence on the freedom of others, but really that insistence is an admittance of something. That insistence is based upon an acknowledgement of our own fallibility. We allow others to speak and advocate for their ideas because freedom is important, of course, but also because we, on some level acknowledge that we could be wrong. Like it's a possibility. You were saying something about, when you advocate for freedom of expression, you're saying something about yourself, about what you value in a society. I think this is one of the things that fundamentalists of any sort, including this illiberal woke kind, just don't accept. They feel empowered to coerce, to malign other people, to mob, because they feel as if they know what they have in their hands is almost a revealed truth about the world. And I've been thinking a lot about how we know what we know, how it has so many indirect sort of second order effects on what else we choose to accept, on societal limitations that we place on ourselves and others. And I've been thinking about how important this doubt is, this introspective doubt, this epistemic doubt, you can say, about how it's such an important, maybe even a necessary condition of the acceptance of liberalism in any society. I might even argue that it really is the foundation of the liberal framework. I've said this kind of 100 times, this specific metaphor, I guess, but I believe that the difference between someone who thinks that their religion is true and someone who thinks that their religion is true and is willing to kill for it is just a tiny kernel of doubt, right? It's the difference between 100% certainty and 99% certainty. Your likelihood of taking a step that's severe goes down really just dramatically with just that little bit of a difference. Justification of fundamentalist systems, whether that be the liberal kind that we see in America or just fundamentalist religious systems, they justify by saying that we have this access to unquestionable truth. We have an unquestionable understanding of what constitutes the good. So I've been thinking about, this and how it relates to illiberals, and also about how much liberalism relies on public dialogue and participation to get closer to the truth about our world. I think this is another very important epistemic foundation, and what Martin Gack was touching on a little bit, which is that we're not allowed to speak and participate openly and freely. And this is this is a foundation of liberalism, that we all have this access to reason, that we all have a right to participate in public discourse, and that this public discourse is our vehicle for understanding the truth about the world, that we do not have access to a revealed truth of some kind, right? And this is how the politics of identity that are just increasingly just everywhere in our dialogue, and unquestionably supported by too many. They break this freedom of dialogue. And I do want to say that I don't think all politics of identity are necessarily toxic. I think that to the extent that politics of identity make a difference between yourself and another group, perhaps that difference is an injustice experienced by one group. So organizing around that injustice isn't something I think that is inherently problematic. But what I think makes certain politics of identity very toxic is that it's not just the difference of unjust treatment that we want to discuss. It's a difference of circumstance which gives, let's say, my race or my gender, this difference that then I say grants me exclusive access to certain kinds of knowledge, and this access I can't transfer to others. Which is to say that, me as a woman, as a person of color, I can make certain claims, and you, as somebody who is not a person of color or may not be a woman, cannot refute that, or cannot refute that with, equal standing. And I think this reasoning just fundamentally breaks our public dialogue, because then the identity of the person becomes as important as the claim that they're making themselves, and identity itself grants you access to certain topics of discourse, and it can also be a shield of criticism by those who don't share the same access. I think this is something that's very dangerous, that holders of certain ideas of identities are by fiat holders of truths related to those identities. And if you criticize an idea that is derived from this exclusive access, you are criticizing the person itself. You're even, denying their personhood. You're a racist, you're a bigot, so forth.
Sarah, let's bring that. That's a great start to the discussion. Let's bring our discussants in here. I'm going to move us to, we've got Eric and David and Lee to help join us and suss out some of these issues that Sarah and Martin and Christian and Isabella brought on. Does anyone want to start? David, you'd mentioned that you had a question for the panelists.
Sure. Actually, just a quick comment. First of all, I really love the conversation here, and I think it's such an important and powerful discussion to be having. I want to offer a quick cautionary note. It's Mark Twain who said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And I think it's important for us to understand. I think, Martin, you touched on this as well. We aren't currently suffering from the Cultural Revolution in the United States. We may hear echoes of it, but it's not happening here yet. And so it should let us know what's possible and how bad things can get. But we still live in a fundamentally free society, and we should understand that, and we should work very, very hard to protect that freedom, but not start talking in terms of tyranny and oppression. And in some ways, we can actually, those of us who are sort of in the anti-woke movement, can sound a lot like the woke movement when we talk about tyranny. We sound like the woke folks talking about oppression when we're not really experiencing either tyranny or oppression in our society. One thing that strikes me about the current liberal discourse, is its complete lack of comparative perspective, which I think this conversation is a corrective to. It actually tries to silence the kind of conversation we're having by calling it whataboutism. It says, well, you're just saying it's worse in other places, and you're therefore ignoring what's happening in America or in the West. And I would argue we have to insist on whataboutism. We have to insist on making these comparisons, because these comparisons stand as a guard against the kind of utopianism that they're actually pushing. What we can do is we can look at what the Soviet Union and radical Islam and the Cultural Revolution in Argentina, and we can say back to that, no, we need that because we need to know what's actually possible in a society, and we need to be able to guard against this utopian ideal that you're pushing, and we need to be able to remind ourselves of what's actually possible in human affairs and what we can actually accomplish through our politics. And that's why I think this conversation is important. It reminds us what we can actually accomplish through politics and not engage in the kind of overreach that I think the far right and the far left often peddle in society.
Eric, do you want to weigh in here?
Yeah, I can continue what David was saying about whataboutism, and I get his points about how we shouldn't demonize that and we should kind of embrace it. I am concerned that whataboutism can devolve into a version of ad hominem fallacious reasoning called ad hominem tu quoque, which is a fancy way of saying two wrongs make a right, right? As a fancy way of saying, oh, well, for example, I saw on Twitter the other day somebody arguing that, Africans had slaves too. Okay, what's the point of that? All right, great. That's thank you. Both parties are bad. Anybody with slaves is bad, period. Don't do this you're worse than I am thing or we're equally bad, so shut up. We can't do that. That has no practical force whatsoever for dealing with what we're calling illiberalism these days. So I just wanted to say that, and then transition into this idea that liberal values are seen as tantamount to whiteness, right? Liberal values are inherently white. Many people are familiar with the Judith Katz list of tenets of aspects of white culture that was actually put on the National African American Museum of History and Culture for a second before they took it down after several complaints. The fact that individuality, merit, freedom of expression, respect for the scientific method, all these things are considered white, is a problem, especially if you're not white and you see the benefits, the merits of embracing a concept like merit, right? If you're not allowed to do that out of some allegiance to a certain group, right, then that in itself is stifling. That is why individuality is one of the biggest boogeymen for those who we are calling illiberal right now. To be an individual, everything falls apart if you embrace individuality, right? Because everything they're doing is about being a part of a group, especially a marginalized or downtrodden group, and how that speaks to power dynamics in the Western world. So I guess I can stop talking there. I'm on the verge of rambling, but I wanted to make those two main points.
So before we open it up a little bit more, Lee, do you want to have some thoughts on?
Yeah. So let me. I am deeply embedded in academia. As you know, I'm the chair of a large psychology department, and academia has become deeply concerned about issues of social justice and injustice. And putting aside the ways in which those concerns can go wrong, which I think the panelists have all very articulately described, I would like to throw out an open question to all of you, whoever would like to deal with it, not how to solve problems. I think that's way beyond the scope of this panel. But what would you argue is the liberal approach to problems like mass incarceration, excess police killings, massive economic inequality? These really sort of enduring and really kind of deep social problems. So what is the liberal view towards that?
If I might, so I think, so all those issues, mass incarceration, mass police killings, economic disparities, all of those issues are actually fundamentally different. They are oftentimes phrased to be fundamentally similar because a lot of social justice activists have them in their sort of sphere of terms, their universe of activism. And so they all see it as interconnected. So it's the idea of the systemic stuff being interconnected and thus producing real effects in people's lives. But all those things have different explanations and different causes and different ways of approaching them. You wouldn't approach the issue of economic disparities. That's even an issue in the first place. You understand that disparities are integral to human existence if we do believe in the individual. How you would approach that is not how you would approach, say, a police breaking down someone's door and taking all their property without due process and holding it for years until the person decided to give it back. So that's torture, which is one of the most common practices in America. So I think it starts by the liberal approach, and again, I don't want to speak for an entire system of thought, but I would guess the liberal approach, on the basis of this conversation, would be to recognize those issues as distinct and unique enough to deal with them outside of a broader overarching narrative of those issues being linked to oppression, those issues being linked to subjugation. Because if liberalism is about, as John Stuart Mill said, trying to trade error for truth, then we should try to understand the truth of these things. And the truth of these things is not how social justice activists see them. These are not matters of race or group existence. These are simply matters and facts of human existence.
I think if I can go next, I kind of just made that decision on my own.
It's open discussion, okay. Eric.
Okay.
Go.
Okay, fantastic. I think liberalism is vacuous without a healthy respect of pragmatism, and that goes along with what Christian was just talking about before. But what pragmatism helps us do is look at a particular situation and gauge the situation accordingly and do what we need to do to fix that situation without ascribing to this overarching idea, this one-size-fits-all kind of way of doing things, which is wildly unrealistic, right? So liberalism has to be partnered with pragmatism in order for it to really be worthwhile. Secondly, it's nice if we can find what are called superordinate goals in society. And what that means is that, two, disparate groups would benefit from the same development, so they work together to get that development. I was teaching John Dewey with my students last week, and we came across one of his lines in which he said the only way to have world peace is to have an alien invasion, right? Because that is a hell of a superordinate goal. Like I don't care how much I hate you, we're gonna work together to get rid of the aliens, right? So, something akin to, this huge overarching goal that will benefit everybody. What is that? What does that look like? What can as many people as possible get behind to improve their lives? So, pragmatism is a necessity. Superordinate goals is an ideal, but both those things are my collective answer to the question.
May I? I think that there is, I'm not really sure how central this question really is. Sorry, Lee. I mean, as much as I like you, I will just dodge it. I think that all of these questions, disenfranchisement, particular forms of injustice, particular sort of disparity in economic matters, sort of institutionalized racism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, these are issues that basically belong to policy discussions. And I mean, I work a lot with politicians. And one of the things that you find among politicians is that they could not care less about policy. Policy is boring. Policy is about like holes in the middle of the street. It's much more fun to stand up on a box and basically shout things about, the eternal history and the manifest destiny of the nation. And I think that the problem that we have is that, as a matter of fact, the capture of this kind of Wokistani left, and excuse Sarah, but this is what I'm calling it, and I will stick to it. The problem with the Wokistani left is that it has, in fact, captured the policy problem. And as Christian very correctly points out, it has actually thrown over it essentially a large politics, large narrative mantle. And one of the issues, and I think that this is particularly tough for academics, if you guys will permit me to say, is how to get out from underneath this mantle of grand narratives, because academia is the land of grand narratives. I mean, unless you go to the business department or you end up in the nursing department where they actually have to, suture people and like close holes on the body. I think that one of the ways in which this gets sorted out is with very specific strategic approaches. I mean, I continue to think, and I had this conversation with David before, twice, I think, that academia needs to find sort of a way to muscle up strategic lawsuits against campus harassment from the Wokistani left. The time for like deliberation and discussion is over. It has finished. It has finished the day in which nothing could be said without actually having, the pink slip standing at your door. So the fact is that here you have a bit of a situation of fire with fire. And I think that the problem is that Christian, and I will refer back to Christian's point, which I think, and to Sarah's point, which is absolutely correct. I mean, the Kantian intuition of a self-imposed childishness, which is this idea of the repetition of the mantra, which is throw out the slogan, which is a prêt à penser, right? A ready to think like slogan, and we just throw it out and we remain within this space, is something that is essentially impossible it's intractable. You cannot sit down and reason through this process because there is no rational operation. So I think that in a way, what I'm trying to push forth here is that you need very, very concrete strategic steps that have to be taken both in the political theater, but they also have to be taken at the small institutional theater. Win the battle in your department, win the battle in your university, then win the battle in your school district, and keep it going. But I think that the question, ultimately, maybe it's just a very convoluted way to put Christian's point, which I think it's really a very good one, which is that these are not one problem. There is no one problem here that has to be solved. These are policies problems, and they need to be sliced up, and they do not have to be given the benefit of actually parceling them out in terms of race, gender, provenance, religious orientation, so on and so forth. That was it.
Well, I can add something to that, which is not helpful. I'm just going to add another problem to it, which is to say that, that answer that these are unrelated policy problems, that we have to insert reason into this emotional process, into this, into these grand narratives, that is terribly unsexy to people. And we also have to think about, I think about, I'm an activist, so I think about how do I move people enough to do something? Now, how do I move them from point A to point B? And liberalism is deeply unsexy, right? Saying that I defend I don't agree with you, but I defend your right to speak. Or this is not appealing. This is not emotionally satisfying to people, and therefore, we find that we have, a smaller camp of very principled liberals, and everybody else is moved by the grand narratives. They're moved by the people who speak like preachers, who use a lot of emotionality in their language, who moralize deeply, and that this is effective. So I think the other thing we have to think about is how can we satisfy people's innate psychological desires in a way that can compete with what the Wokistani are doing, or what can we do to blunt their effectiveness in harnessing our emotional our emotional desires and wants.
Can I jump very quickly back in? I think that these questions are excellent, and I think that the answer to that is really straightforward. You need a very well organized and coordinated communication campaign that runs across very, very large and various fields. And obviously, you need the muscle to do it. But these things are not, you can go and read the Cambridge Analytica manual of style. That is what you're basically fighting. Right. So in a sense, the tools are there, the system is there, the structure is there, and the battlefield is very clear. That's where I stop.
So I'm not sure I have anything to add to what's already been said. So I'm actually going to swerve to a different topic, and I want to comment on something that was said earlier, the warnings that were sounded about the limits of analogies, historical analogies, etc. And they're absolutely correct. I think that what interests me in historical analogies, sorry about this abrupt kind of shift of Jen Lee, is that okay that I do that? Our moderators. Look, I think that what really interests me and intrigues me about these analogies, certainly when I look at the kind of how I perceive today's American illiberalism as compared to my Soviet experience. Obviously, nobody will say that it's the same kind of structure or the same society. Of course not. But what fascinates me is that the individual reaction, the human psychology, and group psychology, I suppose, when faced with these kinds of pressures, and again, pressures may come from different elements. In the Soviet Union, the pressure came from the state or the knowledge that the secret police is watching you. Here in America, the pressure comes from, it's much more distributed. It comes from a mob that may be watching you, or it maybe comes from someone who simply noticed something on your Twitter feed and then publicized it, and then that became the reason that you are under the spotlight. There are parallels in how people react. And I think that's what really I find so disconcerting, how in what, David, you're absolutely right. We're living in a free society, and yet people respond and behave as if we don't, as if we live in tyranny. And I think that is what fascinates me about each of the examples that we discussed, certainly China, certainly the radical Islamist experience. I think that's probably the source of knowledge there, those kinds of
Can I point out something that you said that I thought was really quite interesting, which was that, nobody needed to really direct the troops against Pasternak. This is something that I actually been thinking a lot, because Argentina is a country that was essentially, funded by Spaniards, but by and large, we're an Italian nation. And particularly Buenos Aires, 75% of the Buenos Aires blood, if you will, and culture is Italian, which means that it's not a particularly racist country, but it's a very classist country. And the thing that was very interesting is that the military government had absolutely no clear anti-Semitic line. So I come from a Jewish family. Anti-Semitism during that period was extremely, extremely visible. I can tell you that this is something that still, this is one of probably the most definite fears that I remember from the period. There was no hint until very, very late of any form of anti-Semitism coming from official spaces. This was actually the hoi polloi. This really was in the water, in the people, in the air. So when I hear, the conversation, and this is actually to reinforce your point, which is when I hear the conversation about, well, there is no culture of cancellation in the US. The challenge is, of course, a perfect one, because, it's basically like, well, show me where is the air. Well, it's all around you, but I don't see it. So where was this anti-Semitism? Well, it was nowhere to be seen. It was institutionally not completely detectable. You could look at people that had kind of Catholic integrist backgrounds and so on and so forth. But the fact is that this is what makes it so insidious, which is it's very difficult to point out its actually exact geographical location. But at the same time, especially those of you in academia, I think that drawing the pattern, bringing it to the forth, and showing where is that those vectors are sort of as a virological exercise, which now is in vogue, is something that can meet the challenge of, well, we don't have a culture of cancellation. Most certainly you do. And by the way, this is something that I was thinking before as you guys were talking. This is an old American tradition. Sorry, but let's not fool ourselves. Did this not start with the woke machine? John Lennon's and Beatles albums and just keep going. And as I was looking at lynching, because I'm writing this thing, the less progressive of Wokistan, what I found was actually one of the first lynchings recorded in the US was actually of an abolitionist, non-black, white man called Elijah Lovejoy. And the reason why this guy was lynched, which is remarkably interesting, was not for something he particularly did, was because an accusation was pending on him for whatever it was, and he was actually put on trial and he was released. He was found not guilty of promoting, abolitionist ideas and so on and so forth. I might be slightly misquoting this, but the fact is that there was a sentence. The sentence was actually non-guilty, and then the mob came for him and hanged him. So the interesting thing is that, once again, it's not the institutional structure that is actually dispensing the punishment. Where are these people? Where is this lynching mob of which you speak? Well, it's a parallel justice system that is being configured in this very ethereal, nebulous space, which we just tend to call culture. I think that needs to be mapped, and it has to be mapped in a way that is really rigorous and methodical, because in that way you can actually just answer the challenge. It's like they are here. Garnatia is coming out of she's the opinion editor of the Washington Post. So, it's worthwhile answering that challenge. I can't believe I actually managed to stop talking. It's incredible. This is totally new for me.
Before we get to some of the questions and comments from the audience, are there other questions with our discussants? We've got time.
I'm just very curious. I actually want to pose a question, if that's okay. I did not stop talking.
Go for it.
I wonder, I came to the US. The first thing I ever wrote when I lived in the US, and probably one of my heroes then, of course I was a lot younger, was Malcolm X. And Malcolm X did something for me that MLK could not, which was he expressed the reaction that I would have wanted everybody around me to have to the sense of fear that we had in the 70s in Argentina. I thought, the next time they come, I want somebody standing at the door with a gun, also pointing at them. So there was something about that degree of aggression. But something that obviously, as years went by, became more important to me was the idea of being judged by the content of one's character. And I failed to understand, and maybe somebody has an account of this, how is it that this tradition is being reclaimed by an entire political field that is essentially not interested in the content, as Eric put it very nicely, in the content of one's character? One's character is completely, essentially subservient to your group identity, right?
Well, I think advocates would argue that view utterly failed to address the very real state of inequalities. And so, I think many would argue that that's been tried for 50, 60 years, and things are about as bad as they've ever been. And so that approach is an utter failure. I'm going to get myself in trouble with this group. I am not advocating that. You asked a question, Martin. I'm trying to give a good faith answer as to what that answer would be from a perspective, even though I don't advocate it. And there is a point there. Yeah. Even though I don't ultimately come around to that, there is a point there.
Well, I'm very curious about the idea that things are worse in the US now that they were in 1963 or 1958. But okay, fine. Let's grant you that. I think it's a crazy idea, but let's grant you that. But it's not my sense. Reading through this pretty systematically, that you really have an abandonment of the importance of being judged by the content of character. Is there? Is that really something you see?
Christian, I think, wants to weigh in.
I'm not sure I'm understanding the question fully, Martin. Could you say it again? I think I understand it, but I don't think I understand.
I think basically, I'm sorry. It's quite late and I start very early. That's my excuse. But I think that the basic question is, how is it that this kind of hardcore communitarism is compatible with an attempt at reclaiming the king heritage?
Well. So I think that King himself had a lot of communitarian values. In fact, King was in between the sweet spot between having sentiments for the capitalistic system but hating greed, which he saw as somewhat endemic to the capitalist system, and also having sentiments towards Marxism, but also not necessarily embracing Marx because Marx was an atheist and King rejected that entire idea fully. But especially in his organizing and in his philosophy, he was most certainly, at least on an organizational level, about people coming together, Black folks and white folks coming together as a collective and doing things. Although I think that King put a lot of emphasis on personal responsibility, but his sort of emphasis on communitarianism in an organizational sense has been taken throughout the ages and used by people who may have been on the side of Malcolm X a long time ago, who are older now and who are doing things now to justify a lot of social justice initiatives that I think King would have absolutely probably been in favor for. I mean, he was in Memphis at a workers' strike right before he died. But I don't think the result of the communitarianism in the extent that it diminishes the role of the individual as it relates to political issues, I don't think that could possibly continue what King was trying to establish, even though I think King himself would have been susceptible to the same fault, and reasonably so. Because when you exist in a time in which like there is outward legal segregation, there are police officers brutalizing people, when there are all these kind of things that are explicitly targeting Black folks, you do kind of, I can see how someone can say, okay, we need to band together as a group, as Black people, or as this group, to fight against it. I can see that. Now, again, I am much more of the Booker T. Washington approach. And that may be a controversial statement, I don't know. But I believe that if you cultivate excellence and you rely on yourself, you're going to be able to impact things by osmosis. But I can understand the King perspective. So that's my somewhat long answer about that. I think, just to be succinct, I think that the communitarianism we're seeing, King would have approved of, and in a sense, it's understandable due to the conditions of his time, but it probably takes away from achieving the results he ultimately wanted.
I think the issue is, it's important to look at historical context as well. I think, as Christian just said, as a person of his time, King may have embraced communitarianism to some degree. However, doing it now, several decades later, is a different story for a couple of reasons. Gayatri Spivak came up with a term, strategic essentialism, which is all about banding together as a group to solve a group's problem, right? Even if you had, even if you embraced individuality, it may be strategic to come together as a unit to acquire certain resources or improve your life or things like that. This is what the Combahee River Collective meant by identity politics when they coined the phrase, right? It turned into something absurd, right? But that's what they meant. We can still work with other people. We have to band together right now. Who's going to fight more for Black lesbian issues than Black lesbians, right? So we should go ahead and do that. The issue today is that there are way too many viewpoints within a particular group. Free Black thought, the whole point of that is saying that not everybody with the same skin tone thinks the same or wants the same things or has the same argument for wanting the same things or anything like that. Black people are more eclectic today than they were in King's time. So that kind of complicates things. Secondly, strategic essentialism is supposed to be temporary. You bound together and you acquire this goal, and then individuality once again is the primary embraced value. However, if you are in the illiberal camp of thinking that oppressor oppressed isn't always already a thing, right? If it's never going away, then strategic essentialism becomes essentialism, right? And there's no we're going to do this temporarily and then move away. It's forever, right? So that's an issue. The issue is historical context. Things are different now, and the issue is the idea that strategic essentialism is no longer a thing if you're looking at the world as oppressor oppressed always and forever.
Right. I have a question or a thought or both. It seems to me that if you take strategic essentialism seriously, and we're at this very illiberal moment, then the question is, do liberals have to be illiberal in order to restore liberalism? In other words, it sort of raises the whole Chris Rufo approach of trying to get state governments to prevent the teaching of critical race theory or whatever we choose to call that. You could say, okay, that itself is problematic. It's a violation of freedom of speech of teachers and the like, and there are very compelling free speech arguments that people like Greg Lukianoff make, and I tend to resonate with that. I tend to think I don't want to try to fight against illiberalism by embracing a kind of illiberalism myself, but if it doesn't work, then how do we restore liberalism? And so that's the dilemma I'm constantly struggling with, and it sounds like Christian wants to weigh in on that.
Yeah, and this is something that I think is very important, because as someone himself who considers himself to be in the tradition of American libertarianism, when I first heard about people agitating to get critical race theory banned in schools, I immediately thought of book burnings. I immediately thought of a lot of things that oppress and suppress our ability to understand the world around us and make rational decisions. However, I began to realize something. That is only happening in a context in which state control already decides what is taught to people. So if you already have an illiberal context existing, I want to get rid of the illiberal context. I want to have completely private education. But if you already have the illiberal context existing, you might as well use it for virtuous purposes. That's my thought. Now, there's a problem with this, of course. How can you use a tool that is full of vice, that is wrong, that is immoral, for a moral end? And that's a very serious question. And I ultimately am not entirely sure that in principle you can, but in practice, I believe that you can produce an effect that gets closer towards a moral end. But the better decision would just be to get rid of the context entirely. So I don't think that it's entirely illiberal to say you cannot teach that America's foundations are evil as a fact. That doesn't mean you can't teach about racism. In fact, the Texas bill, which is so maligned about critical race theory, even mentions, please teach about the Klan, teach about lynching. They mention, please teach about all these things. Just don't teach that America is a fundamentally evil country, and don't teach that white folks have to be guilty because of their skin color. So that's my thought.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, a lot of the way we talk about diversity now, going to what you were saying, Eric, assumes that we're these static labels, and so which is very far from the truth. And with that, I want to go to a few questions. We've got a bunch here. A lot of people talking amongst themselves. One of the questions, though, was kind of and I know we've addressed this a little bit, but Twitter and social media has really created a bit of the illiberalism. What would any of you say has been the latest trend that has created this more illiberal moment than maybe we've seen in America in the past?
I'm not sure I understand the question. If you can either repeat it or maybe phrase it.
Well, for example, the Nathaniel Wright, if I got his question correct, was saying, there's class struggle. Like, we see class struggles on Twitter, right? And so social media in America has kind of brought a lot of this illiberalism has seeped in through the way we communicate and through social media. Did that make it clearer?
I actually, very quickly, I think that there is something absolutely pernicious about the fact that Americans have taken Hemingway's approach to style seriously, and then have essentially, decayed into thoughts that are 130 characters in order to sort of exchange very complex ideas. This crap was bound to happen. When you're actually, when the conversation is spitballs, then you should expect everybody to get wet. And I think that this is something that, as much as it might be sort of the market of ideas, I see Lee like the comparison, as much as this might be the market of ideas, what is being peddled is basically crap in cellophane paper. And, I think that the issue is not simply sort of the economy, the economy of phrases and lines. I mean, a forum or fora requires something that is considerably more substantial. I mean, I will defer to Eric, who is the expert in the area, to talk about such things. But to me, I mean, this is very, very clear in terms of what is sort of the quality of communications in its form and its content.
I often compare what's going on today with illiberalism and why it's being embraced with the Reichstag fire, in Germany in the 30s. I think George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, they were a collective moment, right? In which people looked at that and said, okay, we got to do something. Even if it's something we wouldn't have done yesterday or the year before or 10 years ago, something has to happen. If that's considered illiberal, so be it, right? We're giving all this power after an emergency that scared the crap out of everybody, right? Or made so many people feel guilty, right? And in need of doing something, then, okay, the ends justify the means. This is too important for the liberalism we were embracing. We have to do something. If it's harsh, if it's illiberal, so be it, that reminds me of the Reichstag fire and giving all this power to Hitler because people were so scared and thought that things were so dire that they needed to, do things they wouldn't otherwise do.
Do you actually think, is the implication here that these people were baited into it? Because the Reichstag fire is essentially understood as, okay, these are the Nazis that are actually burning the thing in order to build this catalyst. I assume this is not...
We don't know that.
We don't know that, but there are strong indications that might have been the case. But yes, fair enough. A young communist.
I'm done talking. I just,
Well, I've got a question here that is specific to Christian. Christian, what is your opinion of people who are subject to cancel culture? Thoughts on Candace Owens, who is smeared in the left media as a racist and celebrated in conservative culture as an individualist?
Oh, this one's gonna get me in trouble, I think. The second question gonna be in trouble. Let me start with the first one. Everyone is subject to cancel culture, not just people who are famous. And we should realize that. And in fact, it's a more tragic case when there are people who don't have the social or political capital to fight back against the mob when the mob comes from them, because they're going to be bulldozed. They're going to be bulldozed, and which is why a lot of people conform. And this is going to be a personal anecdote here, which I know is not going to be reliable generally, but I suspect, given the trends I've seen generally, this is true as well generally. I just want to be very careful with that, though. I've had friends, who go to my university, and they've told me, Christian, I want to be a teacher. I can't speak up about my political views. Most of them are almost always right linear conservative. And I say, well, how much do your convictions matter to you? Like, they matter, but they don't matter more than the job. And I think a lot of people, and if you look at data, right-leaning students on American campuses, and I suspect the same is true at other universities in the West, do not speak out because they're afraid of the retaliation they will get. So that's one thing. We're all subject to cancel culture, and how you handle it is going to be ultimately an individual, strategic, concrete thing, as other panelists have echoed. As for Candace Owens, I've had a chance to meet her briefly. I have been at the screening of her show in Nashville. She is she seems much less intimidating in person. She seems much nicer in person. Look, I understand why people like Candace Owens exist. They exist to give a condensed version of a particular viewpoint about to people who may not want to go all the way and read or listen to lectures or do more investigating themselves. But I think that if you look at a generation before, they're public intellectuals, people like William F. Buckley, Gore Vidal, Christopher Hitchens. People, again, Buckley had an undergraduate degree. Vidal never went to university. Hitchens had an undergraduate degree. Basically, the base level of education you can have. And these were gentlemen who were brilliant, they were erudite, and they educated entire generations on so many issues. I wish in the political realm there were more public intellectuals like that. I don't think someone like Candace Owens is like that. Not saying that she has to offer important thoughts, but the level of discourse is so much lower today than it was even a generation ago. And I'm only 21, so I don't remember Buckley or Vidal or any of those folks. I'm seeing them through history. But I really wish I had been around when those guys were around, because they really shook the earth. And I just think that people like Candace Owens shake the earth in terms of engage people's emotions and not always their minds. And that can be dangerous. But I have no hate towards her. She's doing what works for her. I just wish she had a more pensive approach to things.
I just wanted to add, to Christian's point, something you were saying reminded me of that, how much does your opinion matter to you, and does it matter to you more than your job? I mean, I think that's a very that gets to the heart of what it means for the average person to participate in our public discourse and discussion, and how much it in a way disincentivizes the average person from participating, and leaves the discourse to people like Candace Owens, to just extremists, to people who simplify things, to people who are comfortable at in this being put in this spot in this way, people who have made it their livelihoods to speak publicly. And I think that our public discourse is so it's poisoned by this, and it's impoverished by this. So I mean, this even ties into the previous question about, and what is the effect of social media? And I think that to the extent social media has done anything, I think it has it has amplified certain behaviors of public behaviors, how we participate in public discourse, that are very toxic. I won't go into it, but I think some of you are familiar with the spiral of silence theory, and if not, just look it up. But the idea is essentially that somebody says something, and then they are pilloried for it. Everyone else sees that and is less is more hesitant to speak up and share the same view, even if they agree with it. And then this whole effect just compounds, and what ends up happening is the views that are left are the only views that people think that they won't get in trouble for saying, and the only people that are speaking are the people who are comfortable with the social harms that come with speaking out. So social media does do this. I think social media has amplified this. It has created this environment where, I mean, to its benefit. I will say, I do think it is harder for authoritarian governments to control our speech in a way that they simply can't do in a way that they could in the past. However, it is easier for corporations to control it, and it is easier for toxic. I don't even know what to call it, because it's not quite authoritarian if one person is in control yet, but there's these ways of behaving culturally together that act in very coercive ways on the individual.
Yeah, we've got, time is running tight here, but we've got one question I think that touches on this. And Thomas Payne has asked quite a few good questions in here, but this was the one that I'd want to bring up. So he's asking that I read that the USA is the dumbest country with the most degrees. How much of that is going on due to ignorance of history and low rigor in education? So we have the question on how much of it is going on based on social media. And Thomas asked a different question. How much of it is our lack of history? And perhaps Isabella, I don't know if you want to address that, but maybe because we haven't studied not only our own history, but other histories like the history of the Soviet Union, that could be a factor.
Look, it's my constant gripe that people don't know enough history, I think that the only historical analogy really that Americans tend to feel comfortable making is with Nazi Germany. And so then everything becomes, you're a Nazi, you're acting like a Nazi or a fascist or whatever. Somehow we've completely missed, the other totalitarian regime that was such a major presence in the 20th century. And so it's truly incredible to me. I think that's, I always say that the left really today needs to know its history. And it's incredible to me that it doesn't know it. And sometimes I'll make some comments on social media and people will say, well, there she goes again, with her history of the Soviet Union. It's not the Soviet Union. We're not building the Soviet Union. Stop talking about it. But I think that it's important to know your history. If you are, if you're pursuing a certain movement, you need to know your history. So I think it's really crucial.
Sorry, I made a reference to Nazi Germany earlier.
Totally fine.
I won't do that again.
Every time somebody says that, I feel that there is a reference to, home. I'm obviously in Berlin. No, I think it's actually absolutely remarkable because I spent 20 years in the US, many of them teaching. so provincial, even in big cities, even when you have like this sort of aspiration of cosmopolitanism. The American population by and large is. And I think that this actually plays a massive role in the question. One of the things that, I mean, just a very quick anecdote is I had the temerity to point out to somebody during a Facebook conversation, a Facebook exchange, that the fascist party essentially brewed inside the Italian Socialist Party. I mean, there is no secret about this. It's not a controversial statement. It's really just, a very sort of basic fact. I mean, so Mussolini built his political career in the Socialist Party. The reaction was dumbfounding. I mean, really, as if I had made a claim that was, obviously this has to do with socialism and fascism being used really as terms that have absolutely nothing to do with fascism or socialism. I think that the thing that strikes me in the Wokistani movement, to answer specifically this question, is that many of these people that now are in the business of trying to disassemble enlightenment are the ones that can only go out with their freaking placards and their torches because of enlightenment. I mean, the only reason why we have, Argentina is one of the first countries in the world that had elective sexual identity. And I knew a senator here in Berlin who asked me who was the electorate that supported this policy. Because in Berlin, if you wanted to push that, there would not even be enough people to come out and actually go along with the political position. So the point with this is that, you do need kind of this process of transition. You need to understand the history of the process of transition that actually brings you to the point where your rights have actually flourished into the possibility of making these demands. The reaction in the US, which to me is very curious, is either we don't know or we rather forget, and let's destroy them in the process. Let's destroy the rights that gave us the possibility of coming here, coming out and saying that we're gay or that we're Jews or that we are, whatever the hell it is that we are. This is at least some sort of short-circuiting in the historical understanding of rights, specifically of rights and the historical constitution of rights. And I think that this is the place where people like Isabella, Sarah, myself, I mean, Christian, this is where coming from our backgrounds, I mean, we can say, okay, well, look, I mean, you don't understand how good you have it, my friend. I think that I don't know if it was a very good answer, but it was an attempt.
Well, with just a few more minutes left, I got one question that I thought was really interesting. Could each of you guys go around and tell us a book that you would recommend that speaks to the issues that you guys each spoke on today? Lee, do you want to start with you? Oh, you're on mute.
There we go. I lost my cursor for a second. Sorry. Well, I recently asked I have a medium-sized undergraduate lab. There's about 7 or 8 undergrads in my research lab, as well as 2 graduate students and occasionally other people. It's a little smaller than usual, but it's big enough. And we are studying radicalization left and right. And I got this nagging sense that they had no, if I referred to the Soviet Union, that they would have no idea what I was talking about. So I asked point blank, what do you know about the Soviet Union? And Rutgers is a very good school. They're in a research lab because they're, proactive about their education. They are embracing actually trying to figure stuff out. Nothing. And I try to create a sort of mini culture in my lab where people are comfortable saying things that they might otherwise be uncomfortable saying. And to a person, they admitted they knew nothing about the Soviet Union. So my and I suspect, I did not ask this question, but I suspect if I had asked any if they had read 1984, the answer would be none of them as well. So the most basic thing, if you are unfamiliar with these issues, if you know nothing about Soviet propaganda, the horrendous oppression created by allegedly egalitarian systems, I would start with 1984.
Anyone else? Christian.
Well, I have a few. So I'm gonna limit myself to 2. So a lot of things that I talk about, I think you can look at all kinds of text and see themes that may contain what I'm talking about. I was recently reading one of Franz Kafka's stories on the penal colony. And what you basically see there, you see this dynamic between the officer and this traveler is the outsider, and the officer's like, hey, I need you to talk to the new commandant so he can keep this apparatus going on. The apparatus is basically an execution machine. And the traveler had this sort of tension between what was acceptable socially and what was right. And eventually he chose what he believed was right. To keep a long story short, the officer eventually kills himself because he just couldn't live in a world without praising the machine and the old ways he did things. And that kind of speaks to us, like when I say that we are individuals first, we're not bound to groups or identities. The officer had a collective identity, and that kind of made him do that. So that might be a good thing to look at. But more explicitly, there's a book called The God of the Machine by Isabel Patterson, who is not someone who's well known at all, but she actually was a mentor to Ayn Rand, and she actually helped jumpstart American libertarianism in the 1940s. And that book is basically a book of philosophy, economics, history. It was written a long time ago. It has a dated style. It's a very not verbose. There's a lot of detail. It's very dense. But I think that everyone can walk away from that book understanding what it means to have human freedom and what it means to be a free human more than they understood before they walked into that book. So that's all I'll say for now. There are plenty of other suggestions I have, but those are just the two I think are most important.
On China specifically, the one that always blew me away and read like a novel, but wasn't, was The Private Life of Chairman Mao by his Dr. Li Zhisui. And if you really want to see how an authoritarian regime and country is built, that's fascinating. Anyone else?
Yes, I can offer two recommendations, maybe three, but the two things I think that anybody that still has a bit of enamorment with the Me Too movement should read is Euripides' Hippolytus. This should be actually absolutely obligatory, mandatory reading. The ones that are actually more concerned in general with the state of Wokistan, I think should really go out and buy Anatole France's The Gods Are Thirsty. This was actually a Nobel Prize in the early part of the 20th century, a Frenchman. It's a very short book. It's absolutely lovely. And it's excellent at showing you precisely the place in which we find ourselves. Those that actually, there is this character, Bruton, who is an old aristocrat, but he stands really in between the terror of the Jacobins, which he obviously supported as an atheist and as a bon vivant, etc., and on the other side, the sort of old aristocracy and sort of the reaction of the old regime. The book is absolutely fantastic precisely because it shows, I think, the place in which this attempt at fighting sort of against illiberalism that comes from a place which for, I think, most of us were familiar grounds is actually very good at doing. And then when you're done with that and you have a little bit of time, you should go out by In Search of Lost Time, sit down and read through the 10 volumes. It will cure all your Hemingways.
We've gone a little over time. Sarah or Isabella, Eric, what books might you want to suggest?
I can suggest two. So both of them based on the discussion that we just had. Jonathan Rauch's Kindly Inquisitors is a short, sweet little introduction to anyone who wants, a very clear-eyed account of what is happening in our politics in regards to people who are coming from the humanitarian side to saying that we should have less freedom of speech. I think that's a really good book. As to understanding what is happening in our public discourse, I think Timur Kuran's Private Truths, Public Lies is a really good one. And even if you just read the first chapter, really, it's worth knowing the fundamental idea. His theory is really worthwhile.
So I'll recommend a couple of historical books in the spirit of kind of teaching history. So one is The Forsaken, an American tragedy in Stalin's Russia. It's by Tim Tsouliadis. It's an absolutely extraordinary account, amazing book about Americans who ended up in the Soviet Union in Stalin's time and what happened to them. It's just an extraordinary kind of view into what happens to people when they're put into those kinds of extreme circumstances, and what happens to them and how the regime treats them. And then the other one is, since my real kind of bailiwick is anti-Semitism, and particularly anti-Semitism on the left, I've been reading recently Anti-Semitism and the Left on the Return of the Jewish Question by Philip Spence and Robert Fine. I think it's a really excellent account that puts in, it's a great framework for understanding how and why anti-Semitism does exist on the left.
And I want to add to that, because what's been mentioned several times is your piece in Tablet Magazine, The American Soviet Mentality, as an article.
Thank
So
you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
It started a lot of this conversation. So there. Eric and David, do you have anything to suggest?
Well, in line with what Sarah said about Connolly Inquisitors, which is an extremely prescient book, right? Written several years ago, but it describes 2021 better than anything written in 2021. Something similar is Beyond All Reason. And I always forget the name, Daniel Farber and Susanna Sherry. That is also written around the same time and just as prescient, but it deals specifically, directly with critical race theory and how it was manifesting in law schools at the time, and how it was distinctly illiberal and why that was a problem. So, I mean, if you want a kind of blueprint strategy for how to deal with things now, it wouldn't be a bad idea to read that book. Secondly, this is not a specific recommendation. It's a recommendation of a topic. I think people should be more aware of the Frankfurt School and a lot of the Marxist origins of critical theory and critical legal studies and critical race theory and everything that comes after that. You don't have to, I mean, I would like if everybody read primary texts, but you can read secondary texts on these thinkers and recognize where this current illiberalism, part of it anyway, much of it stems from. So I would recommend that.
I'll go with The Constitution of Knowledge, also by Jonathan Rauch. If you like Connolly Inquisitors, The Constitution of Knowledge is excellent. Cynical Theories by our friends Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay. I think if you, as Eric said, if you want to read somebody to summarize it for you and do a better job than the original people who wrote about it, that's a great book to look at. And I like Free Speech by Andrew Doyle. I think it was really well done, and it's very current. So take a look at it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, thank you for everyone for sticking with us. We went a little bit beyond our time, but I really like that end of hearing the books. What I would love to do is there's so many questions that have yet to be answered. This was a great discussion. So I'm speaking to our audience now. If there was something that you really didn't get answered, please feel free. You can contact us and contact me over the ilvalues.org website, and I will make sure that your questions get to these panelists, and I will try to also collect all these books in one place that we can share as well. So thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope that this is the beginning of many more conversations.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, guys.